Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Answers from the Lab, where we share Mayo Clinic knowledge and advancements on the state of testing and science from laboratory leaders and the people who are making it happen behind the scenes. I'm Dr. Bobbi Pritt, Interim Chair of the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathology at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. With me today is Dr. Bill Morice, the President and CEO of Mayo Clinic Laboratories. This is our weekly discussion with Dr. Morice, in which we learn about updates in the field of laboratory medicine and pathology.
Hi, Bill. How are you doing this week?
I'm doing well. I've after a brief respite from travel, I've been back on the road again. So I was off in Washington, D.C. Earlier this week.
Yeah, that's what I heard. And you've been talking to some test manufacturers and thinking about what's going on with our government. I think let's talk about those things. There's some really important topics that our listeners will want to hear about.
Yeah, well, yeah, I agree. I think that there are a lot of stakeholders in healthcare and just in general that are actually going to Washington, D.C. And spending time there because they're, to try and get things passed or, get legislative issues addressed and other things before the end of the year here, right? So, so yeah, a lot of different people I had the opportunity to meet with, both there and then, over the last month or so. And it's just been interesting kind of seeing different perspectives and, because to communicate to government, obviously, people have to kind of distill their messaging, right? And to get it to something that's concise. And so, yeah, we could talk about why they're doing that, but so like for instance, with we had a chance to talk to some of the device manufacturers, some other laboratories, and then also just some other people in Washington D.C. that work with the government and how all this is going to come together or concerns about how they have it coming together. So and I guess I'll start there. We should probably talk just a little bit about some of the stuff that we're worried about in labs and or watching and wondering if Congress is going to act. So,
well, let's start with something positive. Maybe you said you've been talking to some device manufacturers. What are they thinking about right now? What's forefront on their mind?
Well, they're thinking about they're actually trying to understand, valid or not valid now but potential FDA regulation lab developed tests because you have to remember, I mean, they go through the device manufacturing. They have to submit to FDA for their devices, but at the same time, they're selling a lot of reagents and equipment into labs to run lab developed tests. So they're watching this as well. But the other thing that they're really kind of just thinking in the bigger perspective is that, how do all of their things that we talked about during COVID, how do all their different instruments work together, right? I think the device manufacturers now, many of them, a lot of them you have companies like Thermo Fisher and Roche and Danaher and others that have multiple platforms, Hologic. So the thinking really seems to be evolving from how do we get tests on these individual pieces of equipment to how do all these different things work together, which I think will be, probably coming out of COVID. They were thinking about capacity and all the different instrumentation and how the different instruments work. And so in talking to different companies, is how do we keep the pipeline of innovation going? And as importantly, how do these different, pieces of equipment, how do they work together? How does something like in a pathology lab work with something in an infectious disease lab? How does that information flow? So it's more on the data side, things that you and I have talked about before, which I think is really cool from a laboratory perspective, because that's where we spend a lot of our time and effort is thinking about how we go out and try and find these pieces of information. Now it looks like the device manufacturers are trying to build the systems that have them flow together more naturally.
Yeah, that would be great. One of the things I think we could do as pathologists and laboratorians is really help pull all the different pieces of data together from the patient to help create either a synoptic report or a synoptic interpretation. I've been hearing some people say that large language models will be doing that, but perhaps there's an opportunity with device manufacturers as well. If I have an instrument in the chemistry lab and one in the microbiology lab, is it going to actually be able to talk? Are those two able to talk to one another and maybe flag certain results if they're linked together?
Yeah, and I think that that's part of it is that there was discussion of large language models and what they can do, but the reality is that if the data is not, they can only do so much, and it's very much dependent on how the data is structured, and some things about just kind of core about how things work. One of the interesting things I heard when I was out there was what's been called large language model hallucination, which is something I think it's important for us to be aware of. It was an interesting and catchy phrase, but basically one of the things that's concerning, to be honest, is that the way that those work is that they will just try and fill in the gaps. So sometimes it will just, an example was given that it will create a citation that doesn't exist, for instance,
Right.
if it thinks that this should kind of be there. So I think, again, they're great potential, but we have to think about how we're working in the real world today, and that's where a lot of these manufacturers are. I think the other thing that's really gratifying is that you're seeing more and more people with lab experience going into these companies, and so that creates opportunities for us then to interact, because they'll then come back out. So we need to be thinking about how would we, rather than just being vendees for these companies, how would we want them to work for us, kind of thing, as we do our jobs. And I think that's a really great opportunity for us in lab medicine.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting. And then what were you hearing also in your visits to DC?
Well, on the lab side, of course, the big thing, a lot of discussion around FDA oversight of LDTs.
Mhm.
And both on the concern side, the even if a lot of things, if this final rule goes out and it's, what is it going to look like? How much could FDA even put in there? Because the capabilities that they have. I did hear that if you think about the timing, because a lot of people have had questions on the timing, it seems pretty fast, to get a short comment period, get a final rule out, it would be very, very quickly, compared to the usual. And then if you even look at the timeline, it seems so tight. Like it's like 4 years, right? 3.5, 4 years. A lot of that is probably driven by the way FDA gets funding, right? The FDA has a user fee agreement that it goes to Congress every year to get ratified. And that means, essentially, like those who are regulated by FDA have to pay a fee that then supports FDA in doing the work, right? So the timing is probably linked to that. But the reality is that, number one, it's very hard to actually estimate what are the total number of LDT, in the US that are being used. We know it's a lot, and we know just from our COVID experience that FDA struggled with, at first they were really turning around EUAs quickly for COVID tests, but it got slower because they just don't have the workforce, and the labs are so specialized. So a lot of talk just about that, what's going to happen, and then the other piece of it is, it raises some very interesting questions, like if your test has now been FDA approved under device regulations, does that mean you can sell it like a device? Does that mean you can actually package it up as a kit and sell it, right? Because that's why
Yeah.
device regulations are in place. So, I mean, it's just going to be like this. It's a very interesting time, for that. The other thing I heard, which is really important for our listeners, is that the comment period really is a time that if you have concerns or things that you would want FDA to respond to in this, as they come forward with the final, it has to be in those comments. Being in the comments doesn't guarantee that they will, but if it's not, then it guarantees that they won't, right? And
Mhm.
so that's why it's really important to get the comments, for people now. It's December 3rd. It's really short, and we have the holiday coming up, but it's really important that, I know you've been working on it as DLMP
Yep.
chair, and with Shannon and others, and we've been contributing as well. But it's a short window. Thanksgiving will come, and then everything gets really crazy. But the reality is, it's super important.
That's a great point, Bill. So, of course, Mayo Clinic, large academic medical centers, academic centers, professional organizations, they're going to be responding. But individuals can too, the people listening to this. So, for example, if someone's a lab director out there and they're thinking, oh my gosh, I have all these tests and I've been using them, they're really good tests, they're really important to patient care, and I would really like to see those tests be grandfathered in. Well, grandfathering is something that the FDA had asked about. I think that that would be a comment that would be very appropriate to write in and have that in writing. And the more people that write in about that, perhaps there'd be more comments to help sway the FDA into considering that. We don't know if
That
it would help, but if no one writes in about grandfathering, then I suppose the FDA could say, well, clearly no one cared about that.
Exactly. And then I don't understand it. I don't know that anyone writing comments has to understand, but they'll be, um, grandfathering. There's certain things that the FDA can do under the device regulation framework, and there's certain things that they can't. It turns out grandfathering, I think, is one of the things that they can. So I think there'd just be an expectation from the stakeholders that if they can do this, and a lot of people write that this should be done, that they would at least have some response, right, to that. There are other things that are, like things that came out was like, would a lab be test certified to be proficient at a technology like NGS, a next generation sequencing or mass spec or something like that. That's something that doesn't exist today. If a lot of people put comments in, there still would be the opportunity for, if the final rule goes out, for legislation to be introduced to say, here's a new thing that we want to give the FDA the ability to do. So I think that's the other reason. So there's a lot of really good reasons to put comments in, and it is a matter of the public record. So if you have some support at your institution, to help with that, whether government affairs or legal representation, just someone to look at it, because it is, you want to get it in the right language. But it is super important.
Yep, absolutely. Well, that's coming up very soon. And of course, we're going to be talking about other things soon with holidays, but this is something that people should be thinking about now. And
Yep.
and there's so many other important issues going on too. Reimbursement is going to be a big issue. Any
That's a
news on
lot. That's
that on the Hill?
So here's the thing with that. There's I got a chance to talk to a member of Congress, and there's by and large support for delaying PAMA cuts again, another 1 year delay. It makes all the sense in the world to people, but the reality is that the Congress is struggling to function right now. Just to be completely honest, there's just there is, and without going into all the details around that, so the more that we can do to write in, I mean, it has a huge impact, right? I think there's a Stop Lab Cuts Now, which is out there, but it has form letters. But if you can send things into your local representation to really show it's front of mind, because there'll probably be only 1 or 2 legislative packages that go through before the end of the year. There'll probably be one next week because they have to extend funding for the government, and maybe one more before the end of the year. So it's like, yeah, everyone could, even though everyone agrees that it's the right thing, because of the state of Congress, it doesn't really ensure it's going to happen unless there's a lot of pressure. And so really think about writing in, for that too, because if we don't get a delay, then by law, we're going to be, submitting data, which is a lot of work, and also looking at cuts using the old data, which is also going to be pretty, not substantial. Yeah. So a lot there, a lot to think about, a lot to really, I mean, I think probably the most important message from my perspective after being there is something you and I have talked about a lot. And that is, now more than ever, it's really important for us to be engaged in the laboratory community. It's a little unfortunate that, we did the Twitter poll, or I did, and COVID was like the bottom of the list of what people wanted to talk about. I think that's true. When we were in the midst of COVID, those in the laboratory were like, wow, the world's finally seeing how important labs are, and this will persist. And I think one of the things that's been a bit, a bit sobering is that really, it's like, almost as people don't want to think about COVID, a lot of stuff we talked about with labs has kind of gone with it. So we really have to be vocal about bringing this forward. Look, even the Protection to Act, Preparedness Act, PAPA, is it PAPA? Yeah, the Pandemic Preparedness Act, that needs to get reauthorized, right? And you would think that would be a no-brainer after we just got through a pandemic, right? And yet that still has not been reauthorized. And that was what gave Congress the ability to do a lot of things, and the White House a lot of things that was able to do during in COVID around public-private partnerships. And there's a lot of things, lessons learned there that have been incorporated. So we're hopeful that these things will make it through Congress here before the end of the year.
Yeah, I hope so too, Bill. So really 2 things you mentioned of how we could get engaged, and all of our listeners, any of us that feel about that something's important to them and want to share it. So writing to the FDA specifically and responding to their proposed ruling, but then also writing to Congress, writing to our representatives about things that are important to us, because they listen and they read while their interns do, and then it goes up to them. Every single comment that is written by their constituency to them. And if they are hearing lots of people writing in about PAMA and just substantial impact that would have on laboratories and access to care, then that's going to come to the top of their mind, and they're going to be more concerned about it and more likely to take action.
That's right. And I think that's one of the things that I did hear when you talk to members of Congress around both issues, actually. Is the other thing is to really engage patient advocacy groups. Patient advocacy groups have a very strong voice on the Hill. So if there, are groups that that if you're connected, I know we're doing that here at Mayo to talk with some of our neurologists and some of the other people that are connected to these patients that really need access to tests for their care, right? So that's the other thing to think about, our own voice and then engaging with others as well. So to either put comments on FDA or write in around the PAMA cuts and delaying those.
Yeah. Well, lots of great topics there, and it'll be interesting to see how this all shapes out towards the end of the year. We're getting close to the end of the year. I can't believe it. This year has flown by, but some very important things that still have to happen this year.
Yep, for sure. So yeah, people need to keep their ear to the ground, and we'll try and be part of those with our headphones on. With our headphones on, we'll be part of those ears too.
That's right. Well, thanks, Phil. It's always great talking to you. Talk to you again next week.
Sounds good.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Answers from the Lab. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast and don't forget to tune in every Thursday and every other Tuesday.